International news now.
All right, we want to begin this brief overview with a summary video on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in China last week. Now, take special note from this clip of the discussion about the images that were choreographed by China, India, and Russia. These public maneuvers were designed to send important signals to the world and to the government of the United States. So let's run that clip now.
Becomes more interesting once you realize how all these stories converged recently. Not on some theater stage, but on the world stage, at a summit in China, where President Xi was the star of the show, surrounded by an ensemble cast.
Leaders of three of the world's largest countries happily rubbing shoulders at a summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Tianjin, China.
In all, it was actually more than 20 world leaders attending that summit, representing a swath of key economies from across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. But consider the small details. Watch India's prime minister and Russia's president holding hands. The angle's so quick, it's easy to miss. They head straight for China's president, shaking hands, forming a tight circle, smiling, laughing. Then they're taking photos in limousines. Modi's posting on X. Always a delight to meet President Putin. Putin's calling Modi a dear friend. And Xi Jinping is presiding over it all. His opening remarks filled with the kind of coded slights China often uses to refer to the United States.
但冷战思维、霸权主义、保护主义阴霾不散。
This is a confrontation between global coalitions that stand against the liberal democratic order, that see the United States as the hegemon that needed to be resisted.
Okay. So first, note the discussion and imagery around dear, close friendship among the three leaders. All of the pictures sent out by their official photographers were carefully choreographed. They went out of their way to smile with each other and hug and hold hands. You know, you won't see me and Professor McDonald holding hands. We're not that close. so they posted it on X about it, you know. They were into it. So there's this signal being sent. They're really close, both personally and politically, right? Second, note the discussion of coalitional politics. We see intentional displays of cooperation, and these displays are designed to undermine an order led by the United States. So President Xi criticizes several things that are an element of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. leadership. First, he criticizes a Cold War mentality. And when you hear this phrase, Cold War mentality, you can think of it as criticizing the continuation of U.S. foreign policies of containment that were directed against communist countries like China, but especially the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And then he criticizes hegemonism. Hegemonism, which is just a made-up word, right? Hegemonism, and that's associated with U.S. leadership over the global political order, right? And then he also criticizes protectionism, which is clearly aimed at the dramatic increases in tariffs that were initiated by the United States since April of this year. And then she says these conditions haunt the world, right? So who is the adversary for all of these participants in this meeting? It's the United States. Now we are going to divert our attention briefly to India and its deteriorating relationship with the Trump administration in the past few months, because it provides important background to this summit meeting, right? And then we will come back to what these Shanghai Cooperation Organization meetings say about Chinese leadership in a bit. Now, there are two important elements to this growing friction between India and the United States. The first can be traced back to the most recent military conflict between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. And Kashmir is this disputed territory between India and Pakistan that's triggered multiple wars since the partition of India and Pakistan since their independence from British rule in 1947. Now, the second source of friction with India is President Trump's trade war, which targeted India and was initially part of his grand reorientation of U.S. trade policy around reciprocal tariffs in April of this year. Since then, Trump has recently escalated this economic conflict by imposing additional punitive tariff increases against India for its purchase of Russian oil. Because it helps fund the war in Ukraine on the Russian side.
So let's take these elements in two parts, and we're going to begin with the conflict over Kashmir. First, there was a brief but intense armed struggle between India and Pakistan from May 7th to May 10th of this year. It was precipitated and began with terrorist attacks against tourists on the Indian side of Kashmir on May 7th. Now, these attacks occurred while J.D. Vance and his family were visiting India on an official state visit. Militants killed 26 tourists, and India then accused Pakistan of supporting terrorist organizations who are likely responsible for these attacks. These terrorist strikes then triggered sharp fighting between India and Pakistan over the next 3 days. India launched strikes into Pakistan. Pakistan launched artillery strikes on Jammu, hitting civilian targets there, and they both escalated their attacks over the next 3 days, including directed attacks against each other's military bases. The two sides, after this brief period of intense fighting, the two sides agreed to a ceasefire on May 10th. J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Rubio were both part of the discussions communicating with Indian and Pakistani officials during the crisis.
It should be noted here that these are both nuclear armed states. Yep. And so this kind of, mini war, right? I mean, it wasn't a large scale invasion or anything like that. It's always dangerous because of the threat that it could escalate to a nuclear exchange in that region that then could explode into even greater one because China's right there and would be threatened by.
And traditionally, this risk of nuclear escalation has created a demand or an interest on the part of the United States to intervene and try and support diplomacy between the two sides. Right. Okay? So we've got 3 days of intense fighting following the terrorist strike. And then on May 10th, President Trump announces a ceasefire over social media, literally, minutes or seconds before the Indian Foreign Secretary was scheduled to deliver a public address announcing the ceasefire. So President Trump upstaged the Indian Foreign Secretary, who was about to announce that they had just successfully negotiated a ceasefire with Pakistan. Okay? This deeply angered Indian officials and began this deterioration between the two sides, because not only did Trump, in a sense, step on their message, he also took political credit for creating a peace. So
this is all about a Nobel Peace Prize. This is all about burnishing a record for the Trump administration to be a peacemaker, right? And so it was driven by a different set of goals. That should put this into context, right? And that in this particular case had very direct negative consequences.
Yeah. And this discussion of the Nobel Peace Prize is really important for the next stage in this evolution, because on June 17th, Trump and Modi had a very important personal call, and now there have been all kinds of leaks about this call from many people who were part of the conversations. The New York Times had a big story about this about a week and a half ago. But here's where we got a lot of the background on this. So this call occurs on June 17th to try and repair the ties between the two sides. Modi's advisors were worried about the call because they were worried Trump was going to say anything on social media that wouldn't necessarily be in line with what Modi had said or what would be in line with Indian interests. So his advisors discouraged him from taking the call. They had already said no to participating in visits to Washington, D.C., fearing that Trump, and because these invitations had gone out when Pakistani officials were in Washington, D.C., and they thought they were going to be forced into shaking hands with Pakistani officials, and they didn't want to do that. So they reject the invitations from D.C. to have Modi stop in Washington. In the call, Trump takes credit for the ceasefire to Modi in a direct conversation, and then he tells Modi that Pakistan is going to nominate him for a Nobel Prize, which deeply angered the Indian leader and his advisors. Shortly then after this call, the Indian Foreign Secretary makes a public announcement saying that the ceasefire had been achieved through direct bilateral military talks between India and Pakistan, and that the ceasefire was not achieved because of U.S. mediation. So India explicitly contradicts Trump's public statements and what he communicated to Modi on that phone call on June 17th. And more broadly, this episode illustrated that President Trump wanted to take credit for preventing a larger war between India and Pakistan, and Indian leaders pointedly said that the ceasefire was achieved through bilateral peace negotiations. Indian officials clearly stated that Trump and the U.S. should not be given political credit for brokering the truce. And so we have this further deterioration of relations between India and the United States over who should get credit for the peace.
And the Trump administration, of course, is angered by the Indian, statements that they didn't have anything to do with it.
Yeah.
And
this is now going to have implication. Rob's going to talk about how we see an escalation in the trade conflict between India and the United States in the following month.
Right. And so now it's important to recognize that this political fight about who should get credit for peace between India and Pakistan has occurred in the backdrop of an escalating trade war between India and the United States. And that trade war itself can be found in its sources to two things. The first is President Trump's embrace of trade protectionism to cut U.S. trade deficits and build back domestic manufacturing in the United States, something that is core to his message to his base, right? And the second is the war in Ukraine. Now, recall that President Trump announced sweeping reciprocal tariffs on the largest trading partners with the United States at the beginning of April of this year. And he argued that the United States was imposing these tariffs to offset unfair trade practices by most of the world that had undermined the competitiveness of U.S. exports, hurt employment in domestic manufacturing in the United States, and created severe trade deficits for the United States relative to the rest of the world. And the size and comprehensiveness of these tariffs shocked the world and triggered a stock market panic until President Trump paused the implementation of the tariffs. Now, since this pause, the administration has participated in a series of bilateral negotiations with many of the targets designed to reduce the tariffs slightly in exchange for greater investments in the United States. And so he's worked out these bilateral deals in which he sort of gets the other side to invest in the United States in exchange for a lower tariff rate, right? So India was initially targeted with reciprocal tariffs of 26%. Following the failure of bilateral talks to secure significant adjustments, Trump resent the reciprocal tariff on Indian exports to the United States at 25% on July 31st. Okay, and then he added an additional tariff against India of 25%, so another 25% on top of the first 25% that was designed to punish India for its purchases of Russian oil. Now, the war in Ukraine altered how India sourced its oil imports, and so India has sharply increased its imports of Russian oil. That's a fact, right? And it was the war in Ukraine that led to this change in the way that India gets its oil. The United States and Europe initiated sharp trade sanctions against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and those sanctions were designed to halt their imports of Russian energy, right? Russia needed to find alternative markets for its oil because it couldn't just ship it to primarily Europe. And so it had to find new markets for both its oil and natural gas, so it could prop up its domestic economy and generate the necessary revenue to sustain its war effort in Ukraine. Now Russia then turned to China and India. And as we will see shortly, Indian oil imports from Russia increased dramatically after the outbreak of the Ukrainian war, or the war in Ukraine, because Russia offered India oil at a substantial discount. So let's watch a quick video now from the New York Times that discusses this oil element of the U.S.-India trade war and the deterioration of the relationship over the summer. So let's run that video now.
But Trump is demanding that India stop buying Russian oil, and he's threatening it with a 25% additional penalty of a tariff. That would be added on top of the 25% tariff that he already promised to add. That means the United States would be putting a 50% tariff on all goods from the world's fastest growing large economy. It's as high a rate as anywhere in the world. But the government led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi has already refused to make Indian companies stop buying Russian oil. India has never been able to produce enough oil at home to satisfy its own domestic needs. It used to import most of its oil from countries in the Persian Gulf, like Saudi Arabia and Iraq. The switch to Russian oil started quite suddenly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. In response, most of Europe stopped buying Russian oil overnight. That created an opportunity for India, which was able to negotiate Russian oil at a discount. This pivot paid off. It went from importing very little Russian oil before the war, buying less than 1% of its total oil from Russia. You can see that ramped up drastically after the war began. An Indian credit rating agency estimated that over the course of 2 years, India saved about $13 billion on discounted Russian oil. Now, with the threat of Trump's tariff, the question is, could India give up Russia's oil? Logistically, it wouldn't be that hard for Indian oil refineries to rejig their processes so that they could take more oil from the Middle East again. And legally, it would not be difficult for Modi and the Indian oil companies to change the terms of their contracts and start buying oil from other sources. But for the Prime Minister, the problem really comes down to optics. Modi has a reputation as a strong leader, and he cannot be seen to be trading away India's dependence on Russian oil in exchange for a reduced American tariff. Trump has put an impossible choice to Modi. Either be seen to capitulate to American demands or run up against crippling American tariffs.
So let me highlight a few things from the clip. First, note the reorientation of Indian oil purchases away from Middle East sources. Also note that Russia lost all its energy outlets in Europe, so it had to turn elsewhere to keep its domestic economy afloat. Second, note the punitive nature of U.S. tariffs on India, right? Significant. They double from 25% to 50% because of Indian purchases of Russian oil. Third, it's important to realize here that it's going to be really difficult for Modi to make concessions to Trump. India is getting huge economic gains from Russia. We heard about the savings in the video. And there's the domestic politics of this in India. He doesn't want to be seen as capitulating to demands from Trump, capitulating to demands from U.S. foreign policy, because then it's going to make him look weaker domestically and can hurt him in terms of the Indian democracy and his ability to get what he wants from domestic leaders.
Can I add one more thing? One of the biggest problems for Modi here is that India seems to have been singled out, right? I mean, India, I don't know if you might be talking about that later, but India is a big importer of Russian oil, and it has helped Russia, conduct its war, right? And so there is a logic here. If you're really going to try to put the clamps on Russia, you need to go after these secondary countries, right? The problem in this particular case, it seems to me, is that he didn't go after the biggest secondary country, and that's China, right? And instead he goes after India. And so that just makes it even harder for Modi to publicly provide that concession to the Trump administration and stop importing Russian oil, because Indians are going to see, and he's operating in a democracy, so the news is going to scream, well, what about China, right? And because of that, Modi was is in an impossible situation, because this is really going to hurt the Indian economy. But he really didn't have a choice. He couldn't just stop importing oil from Russia in that particular instance when it's clear that Trump is kind of going after India.
Well, and note that the U.S. is singling out India here in the context of the dispute over India, between India and Pakistan,
Yeah.
right? So we have this dispute in June over whether or not Trump brokers the peace deal. And it's really important for Modi to be tough on that, so he's not making concessions to Pakistan, indicate that he's not dependent on the United States for peace. And now all of a sudden, Trump doubles down in a sense and asks for more concessions relative to Ukraine, and clearly targets India because, again, as Rob said, India is not facing the same facing greater punitive sanctions than China is.
Right. And my memory's faltering here, but I think Pakistan also, in the whole reciprocal tariff thing, got a lower tariff than India, which already India is going to notice and hate, right? Because they're rivals. And so, and in the context of all of this, India is supposed to be, and has historically been, an ally of the United States, right? And so they're like, what gives here?
Yeah, and I didn't have time to integrate this clip, but for the CBC video that we've run a couple clips from, there's also a long discussion of India that begins with the background with the steady improvement of ties between India and the United States in the first Trump term. Specifically, Trump and Modi, they held a big... Bonded. Yeah, they bonded. Modi came to Dallas. There was 50,000 people that embraced Modi in Dallas. Trump was there, and then Trump went to India. And so this deterioration in the relationship was unexpected. Right. And it's something that's happened in the last 4 to 5 months after we've seen kind of a steady progress in the improvement of ties between India and the United States going back decades, really, to the Bush administration.
Right. They started working on this really with an eye that India would be the counter, especially as a source of, manufactured goods and the like, to China, right? India would replace China as...
Yeah, and this is something we haven't talked a lot about. I mean, 3 years ago, the expectation was that you were more likely to see conflict between India and China because they were economic rivals in the region and they still had border disputes. Right. And that this conflict, the rivalry between India and China, would naturally push India closer to the United States. But what we've seen is the reversal of that over the last 4 to 5 months, and it's been a really interesting look at the contemporary policy debate in the last couple of weeks, and all the op-ed articles saying, what's going on here, right?
Because they've worked really hard under all these successive, including Trump's first term, right? But also Biden. Biden had that Quad and all these things that included India as a counter, right?
And I'm glad you brought up the Quad too, and this is significant here in terms of the concession last week. So what's the Quad? It's this shared, not really an alliance, but security dialogue between Australia, Japan, India, and the United States, oriented to the Pacific and Indian Oceans, collaboration, but it's targeted against China.
Yeah.
And this is why it's significant that we had the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation meetings last week, and then there was the military displays that followed 2 days afterwards, but India intentionally didn't participate in that, right? Partly to signal, I mean, if they had participated in those displays, it would have created more problems with respect to the Quad. And so there was an intentional, we're going to split the economic from security dialogue. We don't want to be associated with the alliance among North Korea, Russia, and China.
Yeah. If you put those four countries together, the one that doesn't really belong is India, right? Yeah. It's a democracy. There's a lot of different reasons why it shouldn't really want to hang with these three. Yeah. And that's the big message for this lecture. So we're going to talk more about that.
Well, and then come back to the economic conflict. One other thing that I want to say, let's go back to the slide on the domestic politics of this. In my prep for this, which was interesting, right? So it's difficult. So if we think about why can't democracies just get along here? And so we just told a story about how democratic pressures are making it harder for Modi to make concessions to Trump publicly in the aftermath of these crises. The second thing that's going on here is that, right, the evolution of the Republican coalition is one in which there is a limited appetite to challenge Trump on foreign policy issues like these. And so India in the past could expect help from Congress, from Republicans in the House and the Senate, and they could say, can you go talk to your administration officials and help us out here to get Trump to kind of moderate what he's saying. And the transformation of the Republican Party is making that really hard, because now those same Republican members in the House and the Senate, they don't want to publicly break from Trump over India, which would generally be considered as, right now, kind of a minor foreign policy issue, because they're going to be subject to the risk of getting primaried. And so what this has done is this shift in Republican politics is giving Trump more presidential discretion and leadership over a key issue like this, and it's depriving another democracy from having other means of influence in democratic politics in the United States. All right, so now we're going to transition back to the SCO meetings from last week and focus specifically on what they suggest about Chinese leadership of an emerging coalitional structure of great power politics around the world. So we're going to start this conversation with the second clip from CBC on what China hopes to gain from those meetings.
In all of this, China sees opportunity, and it's not being shy about it. These are scenes from a military parade this week in Tiananmen Square, just a couple of days after the Shanghai Cooperation Summit. And this photo from that same day shows the leaders of China, Russia, and North Korea side by side. China sees a world order carefully crafted over the course of nearly the last century by the United States, but being undermined by its current president.
Reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal. That means they do it to us and we do it to them.
And Xi Jinping believes China can become what the United States used to be.
推动世界多极化和国际关系民主化的中流砥柱。
Through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China has sought to develop its presence globally. And the challenge, of course, is that as the US has adopted this focus and priority over bilateral trade and has perhaps taken a back seat from multilateralism, China is trying to fill that void very quickly.
Trying, yes, but it's more than that. China's Belt and Road Initiative may be a work in progress, but the goal of this plan is to physically connect the infrastructure of its members: railroads, oil and gas pipelines, ports, building bridges, really.
They have utilized the Belt Road Initiative as an outlet to develop ties from political, economic, social, and even cultural dynamics.
And so you have meetings like the one we saw in Tianjin over the weekend. By population, the countries involved represent the single largest regional grouping on the planet.
It's a substantial body of opinion from not just the original Far East and Central Asian region, but also much further afield, all of which sees the United States and the West and the liberal democratic order as a problem.
And China showing it can convene such leaders. That, experts say, is very much intended to send a message.
The main message is that the Trump administration is weak. It has shown its inability to pressure Russia into coming to the negotiating table and actually making any concessions. And it has tried to bully India and China through tariffs, but hasn't necessarily followed through with strength.
It should be said, messages are distinct from reality, right? There is nothing easy or straightforward about a three-way relationship between China, India, and Russia. There are deep rivalries and conflicts between them. But for now, that may be besides the point.
Trump's efforts to navigate the world in this new America that he imagines are just pushing Trump's enemies closer together. All of this, of course, will create a world that is more difficult for the United States to be prosperous.
For his part, Donald Trump sees this threat and has already accused China of conspiring with other world leaders against the US. So everyone understands what's happening here. The biggest question then becomes what everyone does next.
All right, so let me note a few things from this clip. First, note that the video wants to suggest that the world is at an inflection point in which the distribution of power is shifting against the United States and in favor of China. And China is exploiting this opportunity to build a like-minded coalition of powerful states that want to revise the global order and reduce their political and economic dependence on the United States. Now, this coalition is rooted in a growing frustration with the exploitation of U.S. leadership in the international system that they believe is being unfairly exploited by the United States. Specifically, Trump's revisions to the global trading system that have shut off significant parts of the American consumer economy to these very states, right? And so that's the first point, is that they're upset and frustrated by that development. Second, China is offering this coalition of states an alternative economic system, one that's oriented around the Belt and Road system that China designed to expand trade among a large block of economies in Asia and Africa through the development of physical infrastructure, such as new roads and ports, that is subsidized by China. Again, this subsidized supportive infrastructure development is then juxtapositioned with the protectionist trade policies of the United States that are specifically designed to hurt the competitiveness of exporters in China, India, and Russia, while insulating American manufacturers and American workers from global competition. And so, in a way, what China's trying to portray is that they're the magnanimous trading partner. They're building roads for other countries, helping things out, facilitating, and the United States has become this sort of selfish, self-interested leader of an economic system that is only now geared from the U.S. Perspective to domestic interests rather than a global order that can help everybody, right? And so they're saying, look, join us and everybody's going to win. Stay with the United States, and only the United States is trying to win. Right? Okay, third, the video suggests that the Trump administration is accelerating these broad structural trends of shifting power, right, away from the United States toward other states, particularly China, with its own confrontational economic policies, right? And it goes even further by suggesting that these actions illustrate U.S. weakness, that the Trump administration isn't bending the rest of the world to his demands, and instead that it's sort of retreating, right? And so Russia is still fighting, even though the Trump administration has put a lot of pressure on Vladimir Putin. India is just turning away from the United States rather than surrendering to American demands to stop importing Russian oil. And so all of these attempts by the United States to sort of, and the Trump administration in particular, to sort of force everyone to do it their way, or the highway, people are taking the highway, so to speak. Whether that's completely the case is up to debate. I would say.
And I would push back a little bit on these claims about American weakness because there's still an important element of structural power here in that the U.S. has the largest consumer base in the world and that other countries around the world depend on access to U.S. consumers to generate jobs and exports and propel their economies. China, their biggest export destination, I believe, is the United States. And so this gives Trump leverage.
Right.
And so even though, right, the video highlighted, well, Putin's still fighting, well, Putin has been fighting for a long time.
Right.
And the idea that that we could have constructed, we talked about this last time, that you could have constructed a peace settlement quickly, that's skeptical.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is all these countries are still, they are trying to demonstrate cooperation. They're trying to continue goodwill with the Trump administration because they still need access to the American economy.
Plus there's the U.S. dollar.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes.
The global currency, and so that gives us some leverage too. You know, so I would agree that, you know, that might be premature and overblown, but the idea that this might be the start of squandering U.S. leverage is, I think, an open question. We'll find out. But yeah, it's a risk for sure to take this kind of approach that, you know, punishes allies and adversaries alike. That's the other part of this that we'll need to talk more about.
Okay, and let me just add here too. We want to be careful here to separate and be skeptical in like this video in terms of, right, so there are already structural trends in place about the rise of China and the rise of India, and the US is responsible for a declining proportion of global GDP. So that's a broad structural trend.
Right.
Separate that from the claim in the video that the US is accelerating those trends with its diplomatic maneuvers and with its economic, right? So we had these broad trends that are difficult to reset because they've been accumulating and going on for decades. Another separate question though is whether or not the policies of the Trump administration are accelerating those trends.
And making it,
worse.
Worse and faster, right? And it should be noted, right? The Trump administration did not invent that, especially the trio of China, Russia, North Korea, that alliance. That alliance predated the Trump administration. So the fact that these authoritarian states united together and are upset at the United States is some sort of recent thing is just inaccurate.
Yep.
It's been that way for a very long time, and it is oriented against the United States, but it's not oriented against just the version of the United States under the Trump administration. China and Russia saw common interest under the Biden administration and the, you know, first Trump administration and an Obama administration and the like. And so what's the question to my mind is rather these other states. That's especially India in this particular case, but also even Europe and the like, because of the, you know, the terrorist policy and the like that doesn't seem to differentiate all that well between allies and adversaries. And so, okay, now we want to finish this conversation today by about the changing nature of great power politics with an extended discussion about a recent interview by Fareed Zakaria of Anne Applebaum. And Applebaum is a writer and a historian, a journalist that has written extensively about Eastern Europe and Russia and the Cold War and the contemporary conflict between Russia and the West. And this interview is going to argue that democracy is on the decline around the world, and that this is a problem for the United States because the United States successfully leveraged shared support for democracy after World War II to build a coalition of like-minded allies that successfully confronted the Soviet Union and sustained long-run economic prosperity during the Cold War and in the post-Cold War world when the United States was sort of the unrivaled superpower for a while. Now, Applebaum argues that the U.S.-led Order of 1945, established in 1945, is being undermined by an alternative coalition of autocratic states that seek to undermine U.S. influence. It also seeks to weaken its relationships with the United States' relationships with traditional allies and create an alternative global order that rests more on the principle of sovereignty while undermining global support for democracy. But before we go through the interview, we are going to do a little detour so Pat can talk about the core elements of the post-1945 global order that is now apparently fraying. Right? Keep the elements of this liberal international order in mind as you listen to the Applebaum interview.
So first, let's talk a little bit about this decline of the liberal international order. What does the liberal international order include? Well, it was created in the aftermath of the Allied military victory in World War II and the relative military strength of the United States that allowed it to essentially build support and impose a series of rules and institutions that would govern global politics in the post-1945 order. So what were some of these rules? Support for globalization, support for democracy. When we talk about globalization, the United States pressures its allies and other countries to reduce barriers to trade, the opposite policies that the Trump administration is now pursuing. Instead, post-1945, the U.S. is pressuring other governments to reduce their barriers to trade, to open them up to U.S. exports. And the U.S. opened its markets at the same time with the hope that shared prosperity facilitated by globalization would create common interests largely in support of confronting the Soviet Union during the Cold War. As part of this support for democracy and globalization, the United States also supported the institutionalization of multilateral international organizations that would govern global politics through such organizations like the World Trade Organization, NATO, and the United Nations. So the U.S. was supporting a rules-based global political order. The U.S. also, under this liberal international order, displayed its willingness to deploy U.S. military force in support of these goals of shared democracy and prosperity and the multilateral system. We saw this repeatedly with the Cold War arms race and confrontation with Russia, U.S. military intervention in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, for example. It's important to recognize that there was a bipartisan consensus in support of this liberal international in the United States, largely until 2017. And President Trump, and we saw this on our discussion of grand strategy in the course here, right? President Trump seeks to revise this order by changing its content. Now, he doesn't want to revise the U.S. position of leadership over the order, but he does want to revise the content of that order. And so he supports protectionism, higher tariffs on trade to redistribute wealth and manufacturing back to the United States. President Trump has signaled that he's going to be much less likely to support the deployment of military force around the world to advance American interests. Instead, he has a preference for bilateral negotiations, often that are couched in the use of economic sanctions. But that preference for bilateralism also means that he's less willing to engage and participate in multinational, international forums because he views that those will dilute American influence. And President Trump has also demonstrated less support for the promotion of democracy abroad, and we can see this in the ambivalent support for Ukraine relative to Biden's full-throated defense of Ukraine because he saw it as vital to sustaining the global movement in support of democracy led by the Western Alliance.
So if the liberal international order under the leadership of the United States, created by the United States in 1945, was globalization, multilateralism, and support for democracy, then what you laid out here in the Trump administration is protectionism, limited,
ambivalence towards
democracy, right, and very hostile, orientation toward multilateralism. It's the exact opposite.
Yep.
And so that's part of the fraying, is that there's a move away from this by the United States.
And what this has done, and Applebaum is going to talk about this in a second, is this reorientation of U.S. foreign policy has created great uncertainty around the world about U.S. foreign policy. Will it uphold its commitments? Will it uphold its commitments to, say, NATO? And this is leading countries like India to pursue alternatives because they're asking, can we trust the United States? Right? And what's Trump's broader argument? That this liberal international order has enabled free riding by U.S. allies that exploits American investments, long-term investments in global economic development and peace. Right? Trump is arguing that the United States needs a new deal that appropriately compensates the United States for its leadership over the last 80 years. So given this,
Let me just add one more thing here, is to kind of rebalance the argument a little bit and give another view of what the Trump administration is trying to do, is that it's not necessarily trying to just burn down the whole international order, as much as if you sort of take parts of it, because there's other parts that he's building up U.S. military spending, for example, is that he's trying to just rebalance the cost and make others help pay for this, so that the United States doesn't sort of bear the whole burden of this as the sole hegemon, right? And so the question I would have is, do you think that the Trump administration just wants to smash the whole thing and make it all go away, or does he just want to sort of recast it in a way that the United States has to spend less and gets more out of it? And that might it might have the same outcome, but it is a different kind of take.
Are you asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking. Yeah,
so I agree with the argument that he's trying to redistribute the costs of American leadership. But I think the strategies and the policies that are designed to alter the distribution of costs fundamentally change the core values of the system. So if the U.S. doesn't care about free markets, if it doesn't care about democracy and multilateralism and a rule-based order, it's going to get a very different system. And this is something that Applebaum is going to talk about in this video. It's this growth, and it's not just in the United States, but among other, we're seeing this in other democracies around the world too, is that some elements of the domestic political systems are less concerned. She's going to make it about democracy.
They want to burn it down.
They want to burn it down, and they want to ally with other groups that want to burn it down too.
And this is the populism side of it, right?
Yep.
That's bigger than just Trump. This is,
right,
and could outlast Trump.
Yes. So let's watch the video, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
I just gave you my take on this week's events in China. I wanted to bring in Anne Applebaum to hear hers. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, a staff writer for The Atlantic, and she has been warning for years about this very alliance of autocracies and their growing diplomatic and financial ties. Her most recent book, Autocracy, Inc., has just been released in paperback. Anne, welcome. So, as I say, you've been talking about this alliance. When you watched those pictures of Kim, of Xi, and of Putin, what strikes you as what keeps them together? Because there is fundamentally the shared opposition to a Western-led world and American power, right? Is there more to it?
No, I think that's exactly the point. These are powers that have very different ideologies: nationalist, communist, theocratic in the case of Iran, which is sometimes part of this group. What unites them is their dislike of us. And by us, I mean the democratic world, the language of rule of law, the language of transparency, the language of accountability, because of course that's the language of their own internal oppositions. And China and Russia in particular, but the rest as well, have been working for many years to delegitimize that language, to get the idea of human rights, for example, out of international documents, international institutions, and instead promote an idea that, using the word sovereignty, which by the way is a word that that the Trump administration also uses, by which they mean no one can criticize us, and we get to decide what happens inside our own countries, and also if we feel like invading other countries, nobody can object.
And, again, to me, the surprise was to see the Indias, the Egypts, the Turkeys, Indonesia sent very high-level representatives. It does feel like all of these countries are, in some way or the other, dismayed by America and what they had thought of was a reliable America has gone.
So America was a predictable power. It stood for long-term investment. It stood for a set of rules and institutions, which if you liked them or didn't like them, at least they were predictable. And now the United States is seen as unpredictable. And the president is whimsical. He might change his mind at any minute. It's very dangerous to go and see him in the Oval Office because he might attack you. I know of foreign leaders who've avoided going for that reason. And so the idea that if you want stability and you want security, then it looks to a lot of countries that are not necessarily autocracies themselves. It looks like maybe you need a good relationship with Russia and China. And it's also a form of hedging. If the United States falls through, well, then we're going to need some other friends.
Right. And you talk about the way I see it is there's this geopolitical balancing against American power, but there's also an ideological balancing against democracy, the rule of law, and things like that. Do you think are we returning to almost a Cold War-like situation where there are countries now that are increasingly standing in opposition to liberal democratic values, international rules of law, things like that?
Yes, although it's even more tricky than the Cold War because the opponents of liberal democracy are also inside liberal democracies. And there is a clear alignment between the German far right, the American far right, the British far right, and sometimes with Russians and with others in the autocratic world. And they are also seeking to undermine liberal democracy. So it's not as straightforward. It's not like there's one block of Democrats versus one block of autocrats. It's actually a more complicated picture.
And the right-wing populists in one country support those in others. So I look at Trump, and what is his anger with South Africa? It's about the treatment of white farmers. Or you look at what he's doing in Poland, where he's reaching in and celebrating and feting the president of Poland, who is a titular figure, doesn't have that much political power, because he's a right-wing ally, right?
Yeah, but you can see that in other countries as well. I mean, there's favoritism shown to Nigel Farage, favoritism shown to the AFD. That's more by
Bolsonaro in Brazil, right?
Well, Bolsonaro in Brazil is actually almost an extreme case because you have the U.S. actually sanctioning Brazil because Brazil has its own political system and its own rule of law, and it's punished. It's equivalent of January the 6th, an uprising to overthrow the election. The Brazilians have continued to punish the people responsible for it, and the Trump administration is now angry at Brazil for doing that.
How do Poles react to the president, in effect, picking a side in a domestic political debate?
I mean, it would depend which side of the political spectrum you're on. I mean, I think that's true in almost every country. That the effect of a U.S. intervention in a democratic country is really further polarization because it just divides people more deeply.
That's a very important point, that it's more complicated than the Cold War because the enemies of liberal democracy are now both outside and within.
Yes, but I should also say that people who admire and want liberal democracy are also on the other side. There is an Iranian opposition, there is a Russian opposition, there's even a Chinese opposition, and they also have relationships with one another, and they are also interested in changing their own governments or in changing. So it's not as if they're, even Russia is a clear picture either.
All right, so we got diverted onto comparing this stuff to the 1920s, but let's talk a little, that was my bad.
That's right.
So I want to ask Rob first, this frustration that they talk with the United States, how significant is it, and what's its relationship to unpredictability that they talk about?
So I'm going to zig a little bit here.
All right, go ahead.
There is this frustration. I mean, what this, and the media has emphasized this as well, is there's always this, like, there's these authoritarian states that are trying to upend the liberal international order, right? Because they feel like the United States is an untrustworthy hegemon, and they want to turn it around, right? And so it's better for them. That's true. They're frustrated with that, but they've always been frustrated with the United States, and so that's not anything new. And in fact, I don't really think that's the biggest risk here and the biggest threat, right? Because I think if it was just China, Russia, and North Korea, let's leave out India because I think that's part of the big problem here and the part of the big frustration. If it was just those three, the United States plus its allies, and that's the key point here I'm going to make, plus its allies would easily counterbalance that and win in a contest, especially economic, but also even military, politically as well, in that contest. Because, China's biggest weakness is it doesn't have very strong allies. Even Russia, it has a lot of nuclear weapons, but it's economically, it's
an oil state.
Yeah, it's an oil state. And, before the polarization around the war in Ukraine, it was kind of universally unpopular. But, and so, if it was just those three, this wouldn't really be an existential, a real big threat. But the problem is that the frustration is also felt with America's allies in Europe, in Asia, and that's where the Trump administration's policies are the real risk here. Because when you talk about tariffs, there's this uniformity in the way that the Trump administration treats allies and adversaries alike, right? And you add 25% tariffs on India, which is a historical ally and one that they've invested a lot into improving that relationship, but don't add any tariffs on China, doesn't make any sense. And then so what's India supposed to think about that? And then you talk about all the pressure that the United States put on its European allies when it came to tariffs and driving that hard bargain with the European Union, which the European Union eventually accepted because it had to, but that has long-range negative consequences in terms of trust with the United States. We're going to need those allies. And the same thing with Japan and South Korea. The way that he treats these allies is causing a lot of frustration, and it causes them to think twice about how much to ally with the United States. And so there's balancing, and there's these authoritarian states of balancing, but then, as the clip was saying, there's these other states, the Brazils and the Indias and the South Africa is another good example of this. The Trump administration is going after the South African government because of treatment of white farmers, right? And so, but in geopolitical terms, it doesn't make any sense to antagonize South Africa. It doesn't make a lot of sense to antagonize India or the Europeans, because we're going to need all of them when facing this rising China, right? And so the frustration, I would say, is that. And that also kind of ties in with this idea of unpredictability, right? That's why these countries are hedging. But don't worry about China hedging. They've already decided. And it doesn't matter who the president is, and it doesn't matter what U.S. policy is. China is already fighting a Cold War against the United States, and it's not going to stop, right? But these other countries are still deciding, and that's the big problem.
And so as you're talking, I want to add a little bit on this. We've talked about Cold War mentality and differences with the Cold War, and what Rob just pointed out is really important. This is a big break with the Cold War that we haven't talked about, which is during the Cold War, the U.S. discriminated between its allies and adversaries when it came to economic benefits and trade. And so yes, the U.S. had huge trade barriers on China and the Soviet Union, but also opened up its markets to Europe, because this was the way to build common partnerships that sustain and contain the Soviet Union and support domestic groups within Europe that wanted to see the continuation of good ties with the United States. He's not picking winners and losers. He's not picking friends and allies here. He's making everybody enemies, right? Where China and Russia and India the last week, they said, all right, if we're going to get shut out of the American market, we've got to find an alternative path. And this has opened this conversation now in India saying, maybe we can't be lining up with the United States. We have to return to a Cold War policy of non-alignment so we can freely move between these coalitions because we can't trust either one of them. This is the economics of this, and then the global political consequences that follow from the economics are significant. And this is also a break with not just the liberal international order, but also the Cold War component of the liberal international order that was designed to contain the Soviet Union.
Like I was saying during the clip to Pat, and it wasn't on camera, it was, rather than criticize Cold War mentality, we need a Cold War mentality. We need to say, these are our adversaries, these are our friends. We're going to treat our friends with, favoritism, and we're going to center our efforts against our adversaries. And that was very clear during the Cold War, and there was a bipartisan agreement of who was who were our friends, who were our enemies. But now, look at the beginning of the second Trump administration's dealing with the war in Ukraine. He looked like he was siding with Russia, right? He was going to say, you know what, we got to cut a deal with Russia to end this war and then improve our relationship with Russia, which could have been, a strategy I totally disagree with, but a strategy that says, let's pull Russia away from China and balance it that way. That was never going to work, right? Because Russia was never going to stop fighting its war in Ukraine. But, the other problem with the unpredictability, he switched. He switches all the time. And that's bewildering, right? And so.
Yes, to all countries and participants around the world. All right, so I think we're out of time.
Yeah.
I suspect we're going to be coming back to these issues again. We definitely have to cover tariffs at some point. We're waiting to hear whether the Supreme Court is going to have an expedited review of tariff policies, but we'll hopefully have some update for you that the next time around.
Great.